The proportion of regular Victoria 3 viewers who aren't subscribed to my channel would make even Victoria glum. Please consider subscribing and joining us today as we look through some of the best nations to play in Victoria 3. Now, I know what you're thinking. Jumbo, if I jump into a new game and I choose learn the game, I'm given a handful of great nations to play. And you'd be right. Likewise, if you want to go for economic dominance, hegemony, or an egalitarian society, those are probably all reasonable picks as well. And then when you jump into the game, you might also rightly say, well, Jumbo, look, it's not that hard. All I need to do is look for ranking, right? Here's Great Britain, number 1, France, number 2. Maybe I'm feeling a little bit Russian, number 3. You get the idea. You could sort by rank and then roughly get a fairly powerful and wealthy nation. And that's totally fine as well. But in this video, I'd like to share with you some alternative picks. We'll include one from the top as well, because it's important to consider great powers, but we'll also consider some smaller nations from across different parts of the world, based not just on their strength, but also on how relatively easy they are to play, or if their starting locations are especially juicy. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's jump in. The Britain of the East, but unfortunately, and do take note, without any kind of warships. Japan squeaks in at number 15th at the start of the game in terms of its rank, and it's an unrecognized major power within the wider continent of Asia. Starting off a game with Japan, and we're therefore presented with one pretty nice geographic advantage. We're an island. Pretty nice going. We don't have to worry so much about forces invading us. And if you go to the military tab, you'll note that we start with 105 regular battalions and a reasonable ability to conscript enough troops to at least keep our core territory safe. As I mentioned at the start, though, you might want to consider popping to the building menu, heading to development, and maybe building up some naval bases and shipyards or ports to build and construct extra naval infrastructure, because you're a little bit behind on that. However, generally speaking, that's not an issue. The other beautiful thing that Japan gives is a somewhat unique perspective on government and interest groups. Here, of course, you have the samurai instead of the standard military group. Buddhist monks are your religious group, and you can take Japan in some very interesting ways, because like some of the major powers, Japan can lead towards some fairly interesting journal entries and decisions down the line. As an autocratic nation with relatively high authority, if you slightly militarize your government, you'll be able to really scale up your military and colonial affairs, because Japan also starts with 2 colonial territories nearby. You will, of course, have to watch out for the Russian threat in the north. Speaking of which, though, there are plenty of great powers nearby to buddy up with, including the Great Qing or Russia if you're that way inclined. And if you wish, you can head to your diplomatic lens, diplomatic actions, diplomatic plays, that kind of thing. And note that you can also declare an interest down here, down towards Oceania, where there are other territories for you to potentially colonize or take over as well. The options with Japan are endless, and with a nice bank of authority and a fairly healthy balance book into the game, Japan is a great pick, not only for players looking to expand aggressively, but also to build up a peaceful and solitary nation. With an honourable mention to the Austrians, my second pick actually goes to Prussia, who is number 5 on the Great Powers list, 150 military and nothing much of a navy. Playing as the North German cultures in Victoria 3 presents you with a really interesting story-driven start, and one that's much stronger than many other nations in the game. Starting as Prussia, you can see there are a lot of different North German states here. And all of these states can be interacted with right from the beginning, because they're all within our strategic interest. This unlocks a whole load of possibilities for the player. Do you want to make them your dominion puppet, potentially go all out and conquer them, or would you improve relations instead? Try and bring them within your market and take more of a diplomatic route. Prussia presents some really interesting diplomatic and military decisions very early on, and as you can see, it has enough influence to play with so that you should be able to make quite a few of these moves. Another thing that I really like about Prussia is that all of the interest groups are fairly well balanced in terms of clout at the beginning of the game. The Junkers, one of their distinct groups right at the start, as you can see, I could bolster them even further thanks to my starting yield, is only at what, 20%? The lowest group, somewhat around 7. This is a fairly well balanced parliament government, and you can see by reforming it, if I swap in and out different groups, I can keep my legitimacy relatively high, so long as there's one or two of the important groups in power. This one is a fairly straightforward government to balance, and therefore you can get on changing your laws incredibly quickly as the Prussians. As a relatively strong economy and starting somewhat in the green, you should have no trouble balancing out a few issues in the early Prussian economy, and then hopefully be ready to take on the threats or potential allies nearby. Prussia is absolutely one of the most interesting international affairs to play with as well. You have the Austrians to your south, Great Britain and France, Russia, and Scandinavian threats or allies to the north. Prussia is a super interesting splintered state to play in at the beginning of Victoria 3, and while it presents a challenge, I think it has enough power to pull through. The third nation on my list is Brazil. Brazil presents a huge amount of potential, although as you can see, it's much weaker than the other countries we've already started with on this list. One of the reasons why I favor Brazil is because it is probably the strongest nation in South America, and this means you have a background to play in. Relatively speaking, free of major powers, the Americans still weak and fighting with the Mexicans in the north, and while some colonial powers have a foothold here, as you can see, it's nothing compared to some of the other regions in other parts of the world. Brazil, therefore, is positioned in a great place to take over South America or find friends nearby. I would like to add an honorable mention here to Peru. The Peru-Bolivian alliance story is quite fun and can be another fun take on South America. Likewise, Argentina, plenty of land to colonize, but Brazil really takes the cake here for a number of reasons. Firstly, you can, if you head into your politics screen, pop over to laws, see that colonial affairs, while not yet an option, is easily achievable considering how you can rebalance this government straight away. That will allow you to engage in Victoria 3's colonial activities on this territory here. Moreover, though, as you've probably noticed, you start off in 2 different conflicts, and it's for that reason actually that Brazil makes this list. If you're war hungry, Brazil could be a good one for you to start with. Again, you start relatively weak, but you can see if I jump into my military screen, quickly conscript everybody without taking any other actions, and mobilize my generals, I'll have an army of roughly 44 troops, strong enough to defeat the 20 up here in the north, and definitely strong enough to defeat Piratini's 10 in the south. You can push one front, select your generals, and advance one, send everybody down to it, and capitulate Piratini by lunchtime and then move north, or you can look to fight both at the same time, conscripting as you go. Brazil is a fun nation to start with, but you will have to build up your economy a little bit, of course. There are notable shortages here. Thankfully, geography is somewhat on your side, and you should have enough land to play with to get you by, and a whole load of interesting resources to boot. Fourth on my list is Persia. That might seem somewhat precariously positioned at first, with the Ottomans and Egyptian conflict just across its borders, as well as literally sharing a border with the encroaching Russian threat. But I think that Persia is actually secretly a really great pick. You'll notice that it starts off fairly militarized with 48 battalions. Its neighbors, some of them anyway, start off relatively strong, although many of its land bordering neighbors are fairly weak and in no position to put up much of a contest. Persia can therefore pick and choose and quickly expand out to try and restore Greater Persia. And while you may start slightly behind many of the other nations in technology, and your GDP isn't the greatest, the Persian start is one of the most interesting, I believe, somewhat weaker players to play with. There are a variety of different ways you could play Persia as well. To the north, you could look to vassalize. Alternatively, if you head towards Afghanistan, other options become available too. You could look to merge your markets with your neighbors instead and take over with relatively resource-rich regions nearby. Alternatively, if you look to the main powers, you could seek recognition or seek return of states back to you. There are some relatively varied diplomatic plays here, and all of that is built on top of a nation that is fairly easy to militarize. So you can take this one either way. The mighty United States of America comes in as the fifth player on the list for very good reason. It's a very interesting region that you're operating within. To the north, you have a colonial power, a Canada, likely merging to become one state. Of course, within, we have a whole load of territories that we're slowly colonizing. America, of course, starts colonizing a whole load of territory from the very beginning of the game. So if you're more interested in that side of things, it can be a great place to start. Likewise, we will, of course, have a little bit of a foothold over in the New World, which will become increasingly important to us as we move through the game as America, most likely. America is rich, of course, in history and politically driven stories, and you'll notice playing as America that there are many world leaders and events that will take part. Again, this is one of the more story-rich nations to play as in Victoria 3, and the journal entries and possibilities for decisions down the line feel almost infinite in comparison to most other nations in the game. The United States gives a huge amount of playability. Ranked 6 in the world, you are a great power. However, unlike the rest, you're not stuck in Europe, or at least you're not based out of Europe. Here's looking at you, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What that means is you have a lot more flexibility. The Mexicans will be your nearest threat, alongside potentially an emerging Canada. However, you'll notice if we look in here at Mexico with their 10 plus 17, and then we take a look over at our military screen where we have 266 available conscripts, our actual militarization, our actual military developments are very few and far between, but our conscription centers all over the place. That gives us flexibility in the early game to really flex our might around Mexico, Texas, and any potential rebellions that might play out. Of course, as the game plays through, the United States of America will present some democratic challenges too. You can take this one in all kinds of different ways, just like any other, and it's particularly interesting in its interest groups as well. Before sending you packing, I'd like to give you a couple of honorable mentions. The first one has me actually starting the game as Russia, and while Russia is absolutely a fun nation to play, not quite what I was going to show you. Instead, navigate to the diplomacy screen and go release subject. Here, you unlock a whole load of other nations to play as. I had fun on stream recently playing as Poland. Other nations you can unlock, of course, include Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, you name it. Simply release them and then release as subject or play as. This will let us immediately end the game, swap over, and start as a nation that would otherwise have not been available to us. It completely changes the dynamic in Victoria 3, and it unlocks some really fun things. So my first honorable mention is Ukraine. My second honorable mention, and one of the nations from the game's tutorial ones, I know, is Cape Colony. Cape Colony is a really fascinating one because unlike most of the other things on this list, you'll notice that Cape Colony is, of course, go figure, it's in the name, a crown colony. Therefore, we have an overlord, Great Britain. Here, we can play two different ways, of course. We could try and eventually reach for freedom and surface as an independent power, or we could try and build an economy within an economy and keep Britain as our overlord, instead maybe finding some semblance of independence and looking to expand our might across this land here, which, as you can tell by the incredible number of states here, of unincorporated decentralized powers, there's a lot of opportunity to be had, and the potential to bring in the UK as your ally and stave off other powers that really don't have the capacity to keep Africa under their control, such as Portugal, for example. And my final honorable mention goes to the Sikh Empire, who are ranked 15th in the world as a major power and do slightly neighbor one of our main picks is Persia, but take a look at this militarization. 99 battalions to begin with, and 16.2 million people within the state. The Sikh Empire faced some challenging and splintered borders with the various Indian states, as well as the British East Indian Trading Company. To the north, of course, the terrain gets pretty difficult, but there are many other states to interact with and engage with. Inside the nation, as I mentioned earlier, the military is quite something, and you have a whole load of battalions. Nowhere near as many, of course, as your Chinese neighbor, but enough to be a formidable foe. Your politics and cultures are different to a lot of the other picks on this list. You'll notice you start with the landowners being out, but being overwhelmingly the one with the most clout. It presents some interesting challenges as well, with an alcoholic leader in charge. But overall, you do have very limited powers to change your laws early on. So it would be important, if you want to play this one, I would say, to just quickly reform the government so that you can enact some actual change. And outside of that, the Sikh Empire can provide a pretty fun alternative pick for some Victoria 3 playthroughs. Thank you very much for watching this video and joining me today. I'll have plenty more Victoria 3 coverage along the way, so do join us for more, and I'll see you next time.